crypto is robot money, and robots are only more and more economically productive and are becoming a bigger part of our society and the world. So the more economic growth and activity that's going to come from robots, software and hardware, the more relevant the crypto rails will be as financial infrastructure for that world.
Welcome back to the Outside Context. Delighted to be recording another great episode. And I think what would be a really interesting kind of parallel with our last AI episode that we did, this one's also going to be thinking about the machine economy, but kind of in a different way, and also like what can go wrong. So I'm excited to get into that soon. But before we do, what was your outside context moment this week?
Hey, Elise. So my outside context moment, well, we've always, our thinking behind the outside context has always been we want to talk about tech and the future of civilization, but we also want to bring in some of our passion for science fiction. And we've always thought, and as we've discussed, science fiction is a great way of trying to understand what the future will be like because although it does better reflect our civilization and society as they are now than what the future will actually look like, it's a great way of trying to process and make sense of the technologies that are evolving right now, the risks they can pose, how we as a species might react to them, and things like that. So, to get things started, I am going to read an extract from an article recently published in The Guardian, 19th January, entitled UK Ministry of Defence Enlists Sci-Fi Writers to Prepare for Dystopian Futures. It's a scenario that would make Tesla CEO Elon Musk shudder. A future where self-driving cars are the norm, but a catastrophic electronic breakdown traps thousands of people inside them. This dystopian vision of the future was once sketched out by science fiction writers at an event this week, where experts were asked to prepare Britain for threats ranging from pandemics to cyber and nuclear attacks. The writers joined researchers and policymakers working in crisis management and resilience at the gathering organized by RBOC, Resilience Beyond Observed Capabilities, a network of academics whose funders include the Ministry of Defense. So I think this is a fantastic vindication, actually, and validation of what we're trying to achieve here in, bringing our enthusiasm for sci-fi and some of the great sci-fi books we've read to bear on some of the discussions that we're having right now, and seeing that creativity coming from the sci-fi community into thinking about future disasters and how we can be ready for them is really interesting as well. That recognition that actually sometimes to think creatively about what the future looks like, it's not necessarily pure academics and researchers that you need, but people with imaginations.
Well, yeah, I mean, that is so cool. And also, even if you think about financial services, they're always kind of going on about black swan events and these things that you can't prepare for and you don't know what they are and they're so out of the box. Who better to kind of prepare for those out of the box solutions than the best? Those are the best imaginations, which I often think is sci-fi authors. So I think that's really cool. Would love to attend the next conference if the organizers are listening to this podcast. Jannah and I are available. But it sounds really fascinating. And I'd be really interested to kind of see what the follow up and output is, or if they prepare some policy papers off the back of it.
Absolutely. And so, what is your outside context moment this week, Elise?
So mine is probably a little bit silly and lighthearted this week, but kind of interesting too. And I also did a little bit of research, I guess, which is that, as I'm sure some people are, like, I send memes to my friends, I receive them. Sometimes I even see memes on LinkedIn, your Twitter, Instagram, etc. And so I was like, but where did this come from? I've seen a few writers write about it before, but I decided to kind of dig into it. So happy to be able to explain for our listeners, so you don't have to go down this particular rabbit hole, where the term meme comes from, which technically is a unit of cultural information spread by imitation, and it was first introduced in 1976 by Richard Dawkins in The Selfish Gene. And then, Jannah, I think you and I talked about this, like repeated in several other works as well, and has been picked up by other authors. But what I thought was a really interesting parallel that was made is that he kind of conceived of memes as being the cultural parallel to biological genes. And so that actually it was their own kind of reproduction and serving their own ends. And so if you think about it in those terms, they carry information, they're replicated, they're then transmitted from one person to another, just like genes, and also have the ability to evolve, mutating at random, undergoing natural selection. Obviously, they don't have kind of the negative impacts on like the actual human biology that some genes can have. And however, I do think that that's a really interesting parallel. And when we think about the kind of how technology is changing civilization, I think that memes are actually a really core part of that can't be discounted, because it is a way that like so many people in our culture receive information or even kind of see things that are happening in the news that are then regurgitated and shared about in memes, or can like influence people's thought process one way or the other in terms of like election interference and that sort of thing. So that was my outside context moment for the week. I thought it was kind of fun. And yeah, that's my little mini history lesson on memes.
I have vague memories of reading about this in some of Richard Dawkins' other works. And I think, as I recall, like his idea about memes was at the time that they were, ways of disseminating through a culture, cultural norms, or, big ideas about like religion and things like that. Whereas I'm not sure how he'd view cat memes and meme coins right now. Are they the kind of equivalent of junk DNA?
So it's interesting that you say that, because I did go quite far down this particular rabbit hole. And not just him, but like other scholars have researched memes too. And I'm sure you've seen like the joke that like, oh, I've just been consuming brain rot or whatever. Like that's something like sometimes the way people refer to memes. There's a whole group of scholars that refer to memes as parasites or viruses of the mind. And so that like, even though once they're kind of in your brain, you don't actually have necessarily control over like how they're replicated and embedding themselves into your consciousness. And I thought that was kind of crazy. So yeah, I'm not so sure he would be like the biggest fan of meme coins or like cat memes, but I do think that he would find that like the way that they continue to evolve and mutate to be like a really fascinating psychological phenomenon, which I think they are as well. And to your point, like, they can be harmful. They from, religious perspective, political ideologies, I mean, and probably a topic for another outside context moment, but like I've also read and researched quite a lot about cults, and a lot of times cults will have their own like internal meme culture. Kind of crazy.
And on that cheerful note, let's move on to the bulk of our episode with Lex Sokolin today.
Lex, welcome to the Outside Context. Thank you so much for joining us. Can you introduce yourself to our listeners and tell us a little bit about your journey in tech so far?
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. So I'm Lex. I'm co-founder of a venture fund called Generative Ventures, where we invest at the intersection of crypto, artificial intelligence, and financial technology, although I think that is increasingly blurred into a single thing. In terms of my background prior to the fund, I spent about 4 years at ConsenSys, where I co-led the DeFi and fintech initiatives, and then was CMO and chief economist. And then prior to that, I had kind of a mixed career in financial services and fintech. So I started a few companies, early robo-advisor back in New York before I moved to London, as well as worked for some storied names like Lehman Brothers, which pretty early on taught me the importance of innovation and financial crises.
Totally fair. And I think that actually one of the common themes across our guests is that a lot of people that end up in this like intersection of the tech space now do have a varied career, some coming from the, more TradFi side, others having a bit more of a fintech experience. But I don't think we've had a single guest so far, Jannah, that said, I came straight to tech and I knew this is exactly what I would be doing.
And Lex is a bit of a sci-fi fan too, aren't you?
I'll admit it, yeah.
Caught him. Got
Yeah,
him.
you got me.
We did spend an entire dinner a few weeks ago sharing our favorite books. So hopefully we'll get a little bit of insights into how your reading and some of the things you've enjoyed reading have shaped your vision of the world as well. But maybe let's start with Generative Ventures. Why did you found it, and what do you hope to achieve with it?
I think there's a simple story and a more complicated story. And the simple story, and I think we're recording in 2025, and it should be painfully obvious to anybody who's paying attention that crypto is robot money, and robots are only more and more economically productive and are becoming a bigger part of our society and the world. So the more economic growth and activity that's going to come from robots, software and hardware, the more relevant the crypto rails will be as financial infrastructure for that world. I've done stuff around AI and automation of different jobs since my first engagement with AI was with a neural art company called Dreamscope, which is now Lambda Labs, one of the largest providers of GPU cloud. Back in 2014, I grew up doing a lot of visual arts, and at that time I was running my robo-advisor company, and I was all kind of haughty and feeling very prideful about automating the jobs of financial advisors and how we'll never need that again because you can just put asset allocation into software. And then I came across this company which was doing the same thing for visual art, and kind of the early version of that with Deep Style and Deep Dream is really janky compared to what Midjourney and the visual models can do today, but it was already very clear that sort of human art was dead and that you're going to get this machine world. And so, I've always been interested in AI, and my crypto involvement probably started with, I think my first Bitcoin was 2013-ish. But for me, really, I got interested in Ethereum as an economic venue where people could build businesses, use capital markets, do payments, and all of those things around 2017, which eventually led me into ConsenSys. I think I've lost the thread on what the question was.
Keep going. So from ConsenSys to Gen Ventures, why did you make the jump, and what do you want to achieve with it?
The long answer. And then fintech was sort of my core professional path, where I'm trained in financial services. I went through investment banking training. And at the same time, it was clear that the web was changing how financial products were being distributed, with Mint.com and then eventually Betterment and now the neobanks and all of the stuff thereafter. And so these three threads I've been pulling along for over a decade, even though today they do sound quite opportunistic. It is where a lot of innovation and sort of venture capital bingo is happening. But for me also, like when we were starting the fund, I was going through, it had just been the moment when FTX collapsed, and it was after Terra Luna crashed out, and everybody from Warren Buffett to JP Morgan were celebrating the death of crypto and how we were all frauds and so on. And so the sort of like Luddite reaction and the pleasure that people had from the failure of the industry. And I had come into the crypto industry being really interested in DeFi as the next version of fintech, because fintech really didn't do very much work, in my opinion. It just put the old stuff on a nice new platter, but there was really nothing different about the manufacturing of the products that fintech was offering. And so I had this frustration, and I thought DeFi was amazing and really wild and alien. And so that brought me into the space. And then fast forward 4 years, and where we are was this completely human collapse of badly engineered levered financial product, an executive of a broker or asset manager stealing funds directly from customers, which is what SBF ended up doing. Nothing really at all connected to the technology of where crypto was, and everything again that looked like Lehman Brothers and Enron and the pyramid schemes that are always sort of led by human nature. And I had this moment kind of looking around and being like, am I one of these people? I've been working in the space for a while. I've been putting a lot of energy into telling its story in the most serious way that I could, to people with capital and to talent, trying to get people to move into this industry. And then a bunch of the folks that are sort of at the top of it clearly had made a bunch of unethical decisions. And so I had this moment of like, how can I get excited about what Web3 is doing again? It's not Bored Apes for me. It's not, can I get to a layer 3 perpetuals exchange that gives me 100 times leverage on, scam coins? Although, of course, today that's pretty much what's back. So I ended up kind of in this forest, and the way out for me was to recenter, which is financial services is really important, but it's not the most important, and it's not even the second most important. It's about 15 to 20% of an economy, usually in any country. Too little financial services, and you say things like, everybody's underbanked. If only they had access to credit, they could build businesses, and you publish reports for how much banking products, the long tail of the global South has access to. And then on the other side, if you get too financialized, you get exactly what we had in 2022 and 23, which is 95% of cryptos is financial services. And so you have you've got somebody saying, "Hey, I'm going to start a bank," and then somebody's like, "Hey, I'm going to borrow money from the bank to set up an asset manager," and then the asset manager issues equity, and somebody sells their equity and says, "I'm going to use that equity to set up a derivatives exchange so I can trade the shares of the bank." And the asset manager says, "I'm going to take those derivatives and put them in a structured product and lock them into a 4-year contract," and blah blah blah. And this is all that crypto was. Nobody was actually building anything that is tied to real economic activity. And so my thought around it is, if we can bring to the Web3 space real economic activity, which is, end of the day, just things that people want to buy that create consumer surplus, that make them better off. If I sell you a sandwich for $10 and it costs me $5 to make, there's $5 worth of surplus that's been created. Like happiness, utility, we're both better off, right? And so how can we get that into this digital space? And more it became clear that it's digital products and digital goods and services that can be served by blockchains in a way that physical goods and services, there's much less of an advantage. And then number 2 is you've had this explosion in generative AI, which has inverted the previous machine learning approach. The previous machine learning approach is, you give me a bunch of stuff and I make a decision about it. You give me underwriting information, I make a decision whether to underwrite the next loan. You give me 1 million pictures of cats and dogs, and then I can recognize if the next picture is a cat or a dog. Today, it's inverted, which is, I give the prompt to the machine. I say, I want a cat or I want a dog, and then it gives it to you back. Or you say, these are my underwriting requirements. What kind of persona should I go after? And it will tell you a specific persona. And so it's a completely inverted value proposition, and it goes from curation and analysis to creativity and generation. And I mean, that's at the root of, I think, capitalism and human work. and technology just enhances and amplifies human work. And so kind of my path was to say, can we build a fund that invests in things that power economic activity on chain and try to ignore some of the financial engineering games that are played to the extent possible? And that nicely overlapped with the rise in AI, with the kind of the trends of the moment. Now it's also overlapping with the adoption of stablecoins bleeding into fintech. So while what I'm telling as a story can be a bit of a science fiction or kind of abstract approach, in reality, there's lots of steps along the way, and we've made a bunch of investments and stuff that plays directly into these ideas, and whether the timing is right now or the timing is in 3 years, I don't know, but I don't think it's 5 or 10 years away. I think it's right around the corner.
So just to maybe unpack a couple of things you said a bit more. So with Gen Ventures, you're preparing for this new economy, the kind of new machine economy. You mentioned at the very beginning, crypto being robot money. Can we go down that a bit further? Because I think that you're right. When you say things like that, people immediately think this is like a sci-fi dystopia that's very far away, or like something that's not really here yet. So can you tell us a bit more about how you see the machine economy as you're characterizing it?
Yeah, I mean, there's something to say about kind of the counter reaction to things that sound fake. And I think it's really important for people to have, a radar to not be tricked. In my career, I've been through a couple of moments where I was early to identifying a trend, and then I was told that I was wrong about the trend for years, and then the trend materialized. And so, I'm pretty comfortable kind of going out on a limb and sitting with it. So for example, in 2008, 2009, 2010, when you would say, a robo-advisor would manage 100 billion in assets and do all the asset allocation that humans used to do completely automatically without any touch. And by the way, it's going to go after the smallest accounts possible. So the accounts that you, Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley, lose your money on, and there's going to be, 5 million people using this. Generally, the reaction from everybody was like, you're talking about the trash part of this industry. Nobody wants that. These are bad accounts. Like, we don't want to serve them, and you can't build a business model around it. And for about 3 years, that was true. There was no interest until there was a lot of interest. And now if you go on any platform, whether it's, Betterment and Wealthfront in the US, or whether you go into Fidelity or Schwab or really anywhere, seeing a pie chart that responds to questions is like, you don't even think about it. Another example would be credit cards on the internet. People used to say, like, I can't use my credit card on the internet. It's not safe. My number will be lost or stolen. And the early payment processors built out shopping cart experiences that ended up using lots of encryption and made it the only way that you really want to pay for anything. DeFi is the same. I joined ConsenSys when DeFi was around 500 million in total value locked, and these days I think it's closer to 200 billion, give or take. And it seemed ridiculously unsafe to send money into some sort of weird on-chain smart contract that would do things for you and transform your money. And today it's pretty pedestrian. If you're like, I'm going to put my USDC into Aave and get 5%, like, nobody bats an eye. That feels as safe as, to me, that's safer than buying corporate grade bonds, because the code is audited. I know exactly what it does. I know the network's not going to go down, all these things. And so this is the same way I feel about going forward, either AI agents or hardware machines who are anchored on chain. So you can find them in the sense that, like, they have either a token or they have an ID, they have something specific on chain that can be owned or traded. And then for these entities to do economic activity, and it starts with simple things like payment. Like, well, there is the things they do, and then and the value they provide, and then there's a sort of financial outcomes, right? So the things they do could be, we invested in a layer 1 called Peak, which is focused on deepen projects. and they give identities to all the machines that are anchored on chain. They have about 50 different DePINs that are using them. One of those might be a data aggregation DePIN. Another one might be a storage or a GPU DePIN. Another might be like Silencio is measures the noise level in your area and then maps that into a global data set that's live. And that's the value that these hardware devices provide in the real world. They're doing something that people want or like. And then on the AI agent side, at this moment, companies like Virtuals are really popular. We invested in a company called Momate, which does entertainment AI agents, has 5 million users in a Web 2 interface. And then in Web 3, it's enabling the ownership of those and the integration into sort of on-chain actions and so on. So there's something that the software does that makes people happy and willing to pay for things. And then the second part of it is what are the financial functions that these things need? It starts with payments, and blockchains are really good at payments of all kinds. And then it gets into trading and exchange, and then it gets into asset management. And of course, it also includes capital formation, right? So like when you launch something and people crowdfund it. And you can do this in a way on chain that's completely inaccessible and impossible for traditional financial infrastructure. And traditional financial infrastructure shouldn't be trying to do it. So if a 13-year-old kid from Romania is launching a AI toy that makes memes that trades at $500,000, maybe for 6 months, and him and his friends figure out how to plug in a bunch of stuff into it, and then it gets popular on Reddit and Twitter, like that's not the job for the SEC or for the NASDAQ. Like just don't do it, because there are probably 5 million of these 13-year-olds and 11-year-olds and 5-year-olds and 25-year-olds that are going to be launching these tokens in the way that we write emails today. So the same way that you can put up a Squarespace website and takes you a second, and there's billions of websites. The same way that you can upload a video to YouTube and there's billions of YouTube videos. The same way that you used to write a letter and mail it, and now you just send an email or tweet at people. The same thing for financial securities. We can have heart attacks about how irresponsible or difficult this is, but it's at this point sort of barking at the past, in my view, when already on Solana there's 500,000 tokens issued per month, where, again, whether you like it or not, this is the situation, where the president of the United States is issuing entirely speculative $80 billion assets that go up and down 60 billion a day. To be worried about who's going to issue like a toy AI agent and whether it's a security, it just seems completely at this point in the past. So anyway, all that to say, I think we're getting liberated in being able to provide real financial functions to all these emerging robots and their use cases, and people are only going to do more of that and not less.
I guess so. You've raised so many interesting points there. I want to go back and remind you of something you said earlier as well. When you saw your first encounters with generative AI and your realization that human art is dead, quote, and we're moving into the future now. And what you've said about the rise of the robots, whether in hardware or software form, combination of both, and a world in which we're moving into the AIs increasingly making decisions, increasingly advising people on the decisions that they should make, and increasingly participating economically themselves as well. And combined with, although you said that you're not keen to invest in the financial engineering side, you're really more interested in the real world use cases, combined with a world where there is all this financial engineering going on, and where a 13-year-old with some initiative can launch a meme coin. it feels sort of cold and bleak and detached from human reality when you look at it in its entirety, and detached from the lived human experience and from society. How how do you see that fitting together with our kind of future social structures and how they're evolving, and how we ensure that all of this that's happening does have some utility for society ultimately?
Well, that question is definitely above my pay grade. I mean, I thought about it, so I can say some stuff, but I think what Lehman Brothers taught me very early on is to market, which is to try to figure out where you are as fast as possible. And that comes from, there was a moment where the investment banks were fighting to not mark to market their balance sheets during the crisis, because if they mark to market the mortgages, the mortgage-backed securities, they would be not bankrupt, but illiquid, and like the whole system would collapse. And I think whoever did it first ended up wiping out. I mean, I don't remember exactly the details, but I remember that concept. And pretending that it's not the case isn't going to get you out of the situation where it is the case. So it's much better to say, okay, this is the situation, and then where do we go? I think in this current moment, we have a very intense acceleration away from humanistic principles. And while there are brief kind of pockets of people who are interested in humanistic principles, meaning something a little bit more collectivist, or paying attention to the human experience, or thinking about protecting human dignity, I think culturally that's a moment that's both has passed and for which there's very little opportunity. And I think trying to stop the train through regulation like Europe has, motivated by the desires to create a softer landing, I think right now it is not going to work, largely because the people who are trying to do that tend to have almost no understanding of what it is they're trying to regulate. And so the only effect of preemptive regulation is a complete lack of competitiveness, sort of economic collapse in terms of absolutely zero relevance to new growth, to new economic growth, and then exclusion from participation in the global race. That said, the global race, the acceleration, is just, in my mind, two cars racing into a wall. And the two cars are the US and China. I'm pretty pessimistic about the chance of anything being done. What I do think will happen is that there is always a reaction and a counter reaction. So if you look at things like social media, I, as like barely a millennial, like an old millennial, like I was seduced by social media, and much of my generation was seduced by social media, and we all kind of went into Instagram to make our lifestyles look very particular, and sort of all the fronting that came with it, because we weren't really educated how to live in the algorithmic world. So we were seduced by that social pressure. And Gen Z after us, I think, is much more realistic and has pushed much more against social media. And it is now being seen as the equivalent to smoking, right? It's a drug. And so,
but they still do it. And I being in the US when the TikTok ban took place for, it was like something like 10 hours. I had some of my young cousins messaging me going like, can I come live with you in the UK because TikTok is banned? So even though they do view it as a drug, it still shapes their lives. It shapes how they search for things, how they look for things. But no, carry on. I agree. I guess what I'm saying is, even though they know it, it's kind of like, I guess, the older generation who smoked even though they knew it was really bad.
Yeah, I mean,
I was
but
about to
that's
make sorry, I was about to make the same analogy of, the millennials and Gen Z were the generations who knew that smoking was bad and that drinking was bad, but we did it anyway. And I guess the thing is, it's that transitional phase of learning to live with the risk and what you're willing to accept and what not. And over time, it just became, less acceptable to live with a lot of it.
Yeah, and I mean, there's no way out. It's the opium wars in China. Like they're just going to happen. And it's the same thing for algorithmic entertainment and for the mass shaping of human psychology with these gigantic personalized algorithms. It's done, and it'll never go back. I think if we go into science fiction, like Kevin Kelly, who's the founder and editor of Wired magazine, covered the first internet boom. Amazing writer, super prolific, wrote a book called The Technium and it's called What Technology Wants, and kind of describing how the superorganism of technology has gotten structured and continues to expand, and how it's pretty indifferent to the individual human agents that carry it forward. And Kevin Kelly lives on a farm in the woods in the end of his life, after having made lots of money and known absolutely everything about tech that there is. And I think there's a lot of people who respond in this way. And like the more tech native you are, the more the desire to cut it all off, because you know just how poisonous it can be. On the other hand, I think as we go into, Kurzweil was ridiculed for the singularity and sort of fallen out of flavor, I think, or it's become a bit of a punchline. But to me, it feels like we're pretty on track for 2030, where we now have AI models that are at the level of specialty PhDs in every single discipline that can be accessed for a pretty negligible fee by any person in the world. And then those models will be able to take action and to access financial services and to clone people, their visage, and so on. So I think we're actually getting pretty close to runaway intelligence explosion. Even, I mean, you can look at the politics in the US as another example of this, where sort of the techno autocrat class is now in charge of the government. So
we would probably need a whole other podcast to discuss that. But no, I agree. And I do actually, it's interesting because we have recorded the episode that will come out right before this one is all about AI. So, nothing on the crypto side, but all about AI. And we did talk about this development of agents quite a lot there too. But I guess I don't want to end on a completely bleak note, because I know, as what you said at the beginning of the podcast, that, part of the reason that you started Gen Ventures is because you wanted to find your way out of the forest. You wanted to be excited about this again. So I guess my question is, when you think about the future and the kind of future that you want to invest in, what do you think the potential is to actually avoid some of these dystopias? And are there any choices that we can be making now to avoid them, maybe either with investment, or I know you mentioned the regulatory challenges as well, but is there a better way forward that you see?
Yeah, I mean, that's why I kind of started saying it's above my pay grade, because I think characterizing things as a dystopia is really challenging. Because I'm sure if you talk to somebody from the 1850s and you make them work at Cravath, or any law firm, or Ernst and Young, and you say, hey, your job now is to sit 80 hours a week and click on a keyboard button while arguing with clients, they would think that's a dystopian hellscape, which, to be clear, it is. So what I think will happen is not that there's some evil world we're going to, but rather that humans are as Charles Strauss in Accelerando, or as in the Neuromancer books, very vividly, lots of literature describes, is the merging of human and machine, right? So the idea of like centaurs or cyborgs, or I mean, we're already cyborgs. We don't have our iPhones kind of drilled into our brain the way that the 80s would have you, but we all feel as if the phone is a limb, like it's a psychic appendage, right? So I think we are already enmeshed in these superorganisms, technology superorganisms, and then these like hyperstructures like the giant news feed and things like that, the social networks. And I think the human animal is changing to be able to be competitive and exist in such an environment. I think that will naturally imply that some of the people and values that we hold very dear will be completely uncompetitive and die out and be irrelevant. And on the other hand, some of the people that in the past weren't particularly productive may become hyper-productive and become extremely influential. And you're just going to, have this cultural shift. One anecdote that kind of stays with me is from, actually, I forget where it's from, but it's about horses, So when there was the transition from people using horses for transportation and people using cars for transportation, kind of the question was, well, the horse doesn't just provide me transportation. I also love my horse. Like, I have an emotional connection with the horse. It served me for many years, and like we know each other, and like I feed it and I take care of it. And so there's a deeper sort of relationship there. And of course, 100 years forward, we know that none of that matters whatsoever, right? Like the only thing people cared about was transportation. No horses are used for transportation at all, so all of their other functions don't matter, and utility wins out longer term. So the same thing we say about certain human professions, like my financial advisor has supported me through some really emotional moments, and I've known them for many years, and like we take care of each other, and she's taking care of me. I mean, it's just the description of your nice feelings about the horse, where in fact you want transportation, and the transportation, the financial sense is like, you want to be super rich and you don't want to work, and you want to have all your work done for you, or all your investing done for you, and you want all your trips planned and everything done, right? And so I think we're going into that world where you're going to have a lot less squishiness in your service providers and in your relationship with experts. And I think, whether it's creativity or whether it's emotional labor, any of the things that people say that robots are bad at, it's simply not true. Robots are much better at both creativity and emotional labor than people. They're infinitely patient. They have infinite range for recombination and so on. So I think we don't yet know what our role will be in a world where, software can do all the things. I think it's really unclear. And my focus would be on figuring out how to get through that fog in a way that's sort of consistent with my values, and where I can feel good about the companies that we fund, and we haven't taken advantage of anybody, and generally they're adding to people's experiences. I no longer believe in sort of the talking about the poetry of human flourishing and so on. I just don't. I think that was like maybe a practical answer in 2014, and I think today we just need to white knuckle ride it and survive to the other side. So maybe, and then what kind of gives me additional hope is I think that the generations that come after us are just so different from us, or will be so different from us in terms of the tools they have and how they're raised and the architecture of the society in which they live, that like they're not going to judge the environment in the way that we judge it. They're going to have different norms, and I think humans are pretty resilient to thriving in different types of environments. So I guess all that to say is, like, I don't think it's a dystopia. I just think it's a very different world that we're racing towards. And the most we can control is just in the short term, if we're consistent with our own values.
I have to say, I was quite depressed in the middle of this podcast, Lex, but I think the way you've brought it together at the end is really nice. I think the way you framed it, the fact that technological change is happening. It's having an impact on our society. It's having an impact on individual behaviors. That's changing our society as well. And that's not a thing we can stop. That's just a thing that's happening right now. And that, you know, the best possible way as individuals to respond to it is to try and influence it in ways that, you know, align with our values, but also to realize that the future is just going to be different in so many ways, just as, you know, your person of the 1850s couldn't have comprehended both the good and the bad that we might perceive in life today. So we can't necessarily comprehend what the future holds. And all the models we have of these dystopias, all the models that we have of the utopias as well, say more about us right now than they do about what the future will actually look like. Thank you. That's been incredibly thought-provoking. I think there's a number of strands there that we'd love to explore in more depth in the future. But this has been a great starting place for and some really thought-provoking material as well, and a different view of what the future can look like.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you.